doctoral student here at CIIS, and his dissertation topic is on
the application of transpersonal theory in the treatment of addiction.
So Peter will give about a 15-minute overview of where he's coming from, and then we'll have Peter and Adrian dialogue, and then we'll open it up for questions.
I just wanted to congratulate Adrian. 15 years of being clean is a huge achievement.
Peter, we can't hear you very well.
Okay, sorry. And thank you for the talk. Okay, thank you. Adrian and I share very similar experiences, but we're separated by a generation. Adrian was a hippie, I was a yuppie. He was addicted to opiates, I was addicted to stimulants. And our treatment experiences are very much the same. I went into treatment, I think, about 17 times too. And I didn't actually know much about entheogens, although transpersonal theory, although entheogens are a big part of transpersonal theory. I was actually concerned with creating a modality that was legal. So I didn't really look into this, too much into this until the last 3 weeks when they kindly asked me to come here and give a talk on this. During Adrian's talk, I was struck by something that Adrian said, that there was an existential reason for addiction, that we're stuck in a materialist, reductionist paradigm, and this is one of the reasons for addiction. The etiology of addiction is explained that way. And it reminded me that 92% of Americans actually believe in God. So I guess for the rest of the 8% of us, this is where addiction, comes into it. I guess we're doomed, the 8% of us are doomed. When I was doing my research on entheogens, I felt very envious that this alternative was not presented to me when I sought treatment, and I was wondering why this was the case. Right? And well, I have a couple of explanations for this, but mainly I was interested in how we could bring entheogens into the broader treatment environment in North America. Currently, entheogens, a lot of these entheogens are illegal, and although Adrian was very eloquent and poetic in how he described how entheogens worked, really, well, how about I do this? I'm going to give a quick presentation on Addiction 101 on how addiction is actually treated in America, and I think I'll cut through and explain why we don't use entheogens here. And for this, I had presented I had written on a blackboard 5 basic models of treatment that is used in America right now. Basically, a treatment model is conceptualized, our way of conceptualizing treatment in America. There's 5 different models, okay? There's a moral model, a learning model, a disease model, self-medication model, and social models. Adrian actually touched on a little bit of each as far as the etiology of addiction. Etiology meaning the cause of addiction. When I first went to treatment, okay, 93% of treatment centers use the 12-step model. The 12-step model is part of the moral model, the moral and disease model. One of the etiologies of addiction, which Adrian failed to mention, okay, and this is very important, is the moral model. We're addicts because we're morally deficient. Okay, right? We discussed a lot of different etiologies except this one, and 93% of treatment centers in America actually subscribe to this model. Right? Partially the moral model and partially the disease model. There's biological factors. The transpersonal model comes from a different approach. The transpersonal model comes from the theory that we use drugs to transcend, right? To transcend to different levels of consciousness. We don't use drugs because we're morally weak. We use them to transcend. It's a healthy human need to transcend to different levels of consciousness. This is a basic, natural, and healthy human instinct. But part of the problem is that our attempts to self-initiate go awry, right? And we then become addicted to our drug of choice. And so, what I wanted to be clear, if anything, I wanted to be clear was in terms of entheogens and the treatment of addiction is that we have to be very careful not to cross over to the moral area. And very often in transpersonal psychology, we read books that praise the 12-step model, right? We read a lot of books. We have The Thirst for Wholeness. Stan Grof talked about the 12-step model, right? Well, back in the 1980s, in the 1970s, when transpersonal psychology first started, we needed examples of spirituality being used to heal things, right? We needed an example whereby spirituality was used to heal something. And so we picked Alcoholics Anonymous, right? But Alcoholics Anonymous needed us just as much. So they always point to Jung, right? They point to transpersonal theorists as supporting them. But we come from two different, and I can't stress this enough, we come from two different points of view, which affect the trajectory of treatment. One is moral, the other one is self-medication. We're trying to transcend, right? So from these two viewpoints, the treatment is completely different. The moral treatment is complete abstinence. Don't do any more drugs. The self-medication model gives us the leeway to try other types of treatments beyond just basically changing our moral character. And if there's anything I wanted to leave this presentation with, was just this aspect of transpersonal psychology, and to explain, and to try and explain where we got mixed up with the 12-step program. We're both spiritual, right? We're both into spirituality, but their spiritualities, how can I say it? And I don't want to step on anyone's toes here about the 12-step model. It's just different. They view addiction as a moral weakness. We view it as attempts to transcend that have gone awry. That's it.
Peter, I think that it's a good point. I did not mention the concept of moral inadequacy because it's so dated. But we have to remember the ideology, if you will, of the 12-step program, its sources. So when Bill W. and Dr. Bob started AA, it was in the 1930s. So try to imagine the consciousness of the nation in the 1930s. It's pretty hard. But it was very moralizing. And in those days, people made no distinction between spirituality and religiosity. And the prevailing religiosity here in the US of A is Protestantism, which is very moralizing.
But yes, but it doesn't change the fact that currently most treatments subscribe to the 12-step model.
Well, most treatment centers do incorporate the 12-step program as part of their recommended activities for the people there. Now, whether or not, because the 12-step program has a proven track record of efficacy, whether or not they are emphasizing the psychodynamic benefits of the 12-step program, or they're emphasizing the moral wonderfulness of being in abstinence is, I don't know, you may be better informed than I in terms of percentage of treatment programs that emphasize the moralizing part.
Well, this isn't so important, is that the 12-step programs argue for complete abstinence, right? So the option of using any entheogenics is cut out. we cannot be in a 12-step, you cannot be in a 12-step program and go to your support group and tell them that you've used entheogenic.
That's exactly right, Peter. Bill W., one of the two founders of AA, when he was around 20 years clean, he took some LSD. I don't know the story of how he came to do this, but he took some acid and he had a fantastic time. And after the trip, he said this could be of great benefit to recovering alcoholics. And he started running around to AA meetings trying to convince people or suggest to them at least that LSD could be used to enhance their recovery. He got nowhere because in only 20 years, his stature as the founder had become insignificant compared to the kind of dogmatic and frozen nature of a routine that had already developed in the fellowship. Not the steps, but the fellowship.
And Stan Grof also found this resistance himself to his research. And so he was sort of conflicted. He was sort of conflicted. Where on the one hand, he advocated 12-step programs. On the other hand, it's like, do you remember the Archies with Betty, Veronica, and Betty? Right? Veronica would be like AA programs, and Betty would be like harm reduction. Harm reduction always supports the use of entheogens, but we always go towards Veronica, AA, and hold them up as a paragon of spirituality in.
She's got the money.
In treatment, right? But harm reduction is a growing movement in the United States and in treatment. And if you look at the harm reduction websites, it's all for ibogaine, ayahuasca.
And it's certainly the case that even in NA, there's a lot more criminality in NA than in AA because basically what your drug of choice is illegal. But we found that even so those of us coming from the island went to this treatment center that was recommended to us. Believe me, it was an awesome treatment center in its own right, ibogaine aside. It was a holistic treatment center. It was like really cutting edge, way ahead of most other treatment centers. Even so, being in that treatment center, I could not talk about my ibogaine experience without encountering a bunch of weird stares. Even in the group therapies and group sessions and in the 3-quarter houses of that treatment center I was living in. And certainly in the 12-step, you just can't go to a 12-step meeting and start yakking about how you did ibogaine and how wonderful it is. They'll be all over you in an instant. That's why we had to form special ibogaine integration circles, because we all have discovered that we can't talk about this anywhere else. We need a special container where we can discuss these things amongst ourselves in order to derive the full benefit.
Right, and I really appreciate what you've been trying to do at ERIE. You've had integration groups for entheogenic experiences, and much the same. I think that in our field of transpersonal psychology, we need a coherent philosophy on the treatment of addiction, and we would also hopefully somewhere down the line we would also form our own recovery groups, but ones that are divorced from 12-step dogma, right? Ones that are open, they're universal. So, I mean, that's my hope for the field, but who knows?
There are currently 11 or 12 countries in the world that have either legalized ibogaine specifically for addiction treatment. New Zealand, for instance, is one that just recently legalized. Or ibogaine is unregulated, as is the case in Mexico. There are 4 ibogaine treatment centers in Mexico. The Mexican government is not officially sponsoring ibogaine for treatment. They just let it rock. They don't give it a hard time. So there are a growing number of countries are recognizing the efficacy and worth of ibogaine for the treatment of addiction. All kinds of addictions, not just opiate. Opiate addiction appears to be the outstanding. Let's say that it responds well to ibogaine much better than it does to anything else, whereas there are other addictions that respond well to ibogaine, but there are also more effective treatments for it than exist for opiates.
Absolutely, but I also believe that the push for ibogaine, it would be helped if we did use the scientific method, right?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Have there been any clinical trials on ibogaine? You keep talking about effectiveness, and you've mentioned briefly in your talk that you were a research subject for Dr. Mash, but can you describe any clinical trials that have shown the safety and the effectiveness of ibogaine? Or maybe talk a little bit about what your experience was as a research subject?
Sure. In a section that I skipped, I pointed out that, okay, so Dr. Mash was conducting human clinical trials. She had been given the green light by the FDA, finally, after a decade of beating her head against a stone wall. But then, when she applied for grants to support these trials, she applied for 5 different grants and got bupkis from any of them. This is a lady with stellar credentials who always got every grant she ever asked for. I mean, ibogaine isn't her only thing. She was already very well established in her department. She was the head of the Department of Neurology at the University of Miami School of Medicine, and her primary task was the study of neurodegenerative diseases, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, things like that. So as she got grants and funding up the bazooty, as soon as she asked for money for ibogaine, nada. So she was emotionally as well as professionally involved by now in the subject. So skipping the story, she managed to get together funding from private sources, formed a little corporation, and used that to take the whole affair off to the West Indies, where she could do these trials. And so that's where I went. And her research represents, I believe, the second of 4 clearly distinguished phases of ibogaine research, but the first having to do with clinical trials on humans. Now, a lot of research had been going on prior with animals, rats, the usual stuff, and of course the government, who was the reactionaries who were dragging their feet, for human clinical trials, despite the growing anecdotal evidence from addicts who were going someplace else and getting ibogaine, saying, damn, 1 dose and my addiction is gone. Their thing was like, well, we need more trials for safety and blah, 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 blah. So the New Zealanders, for instance, I just read this a couple of days ago, so it's fresh in my mind, their government reviewing the subject, their appropriate panel sat down and finally concluded that the benefits of ibogaine in the treatment of opiate addiction far outweighed its dangers when compared to the very well-known dangers that happen to heroin addicts from a variety of sources. So it was just, a question of like, well, there's a little danger involved here, but it's nothing compared to what we know it's treating. Now, I will say for myself, in brief, that my life was hell, and I was dying. Okay, I'll just mention this briefly. About I had OD'd 4 different times, was in emergency rooms and like that. I was not dying from an OD. I was dying of a long, slow death called morphine toxicity. This is like lead or arsenic poisoning, where toxins just continue to build up in your system faster than you can get rid of them, and slowly your vitality decreases and decreases until eventually the spark of life goes out. I was about 2 weeks from that point when I went to the island. Now, how do I know 2 weeks? Because 6 weeks earlier, I was sitting in my little room, having just fixed, and doing the only thing that brought any kind of satisfaction anymore. I was having a cup of coffee and a cigarette and reading a book, because I'm a bibliophile. Suddenly, a shadow passed across the window of my room, and I thought I heard the beating of great wings. I started thinking, a bird is large enough to do that, to sound like that and totally obscure my window for a minute, when Suddenly, there was a presence in my room behind me. And in an instant, I knew that it was the angel of death. The temperature in the room dropped like 15 degrees in 2 seconds. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I knew that I was about to leave. I had given up. I was in terminal addiction, so that meant I was in total despair and had lost any hope of being able to escape. And I expected to die with a needle in my arm. Well, not my arms, I'd used them up long before, but whatever vein I could find, usually I was using my legs by then. And I discovered to my shock that I regretted that I was about to die. I still didn't really want to die. I was like, wow, of course all this happened in an instant. So I was waiting for that cold hand on my shoulder when suddenly a vision opened before me. As clear as I'm seeing you now, I saw a grassy sward, like a golf green or a cemetery. And immediately in front of me was a freshly dug grave, my grave. And when I looked down, I could see my toes hanging over the edge of the grave. That's how close I was. And I was naked as I had come into the world. I was preparing to leave it thus. And suddenly the knowledge came to me, not spoken in words, but in a gestalt comprehension, that if I did not change my pattern of action, my activities, my habit, I had not more than 2 months left to live. This was noetic knowledge. There was no arguing this. This was certainty. And then it was gone. The vision disappeared. The presence disappeared. The room started to warm up. It was probably 5 or 10 minutes before I could breathe properly again. So it took about 6 weeks for me to wind up getting to the island. When I got there, I was so close to the end that Dr. Mash almost didn't treat me because she was afraid I did not have enough vital energy left to survive the dose. And she didn't want bad press for ibogaine. Fortunately, the head of the treatment program that I went to had a working relationship with Dr. Mash. She would invite him to come out for the first 3 days of the 2 weeks and assess the addicts, because she was a, scientist lady. She didn't know addicts, but John knew addicts very well, being a recovering addict himself. And he looked at me and he said, I see what you're talking about, but somehow I think there's still a little spark. So Dr. Mash dosed me and I'm here today. It was about an 18-hour trip. They took me one morning from the cabana I was staying in. I had my last cigarette and went into the treatment cabana about 9. The following morning, I was helped out by 2 people because I couldn't really stand or walk that well. When they brought me out into the morning light, the sun was just coming up over the Atlantic. And my entire 22-year nightmare was evaporating like dew off the grass in the morning light, with no withdrawal. I was so grateful. I cried. And so I had the impetus to do whatever I had to do in my recovery, to reconstruct all the damage. It took me like 5 years of nothing but recovery activities before I thought maybe I could return to school and take 1 class. But that began my path, and here I am today. So I spoke in this lecture strictly about the psychodynamic activities of ibogaine. Of course, there are others having to do with connecting you to your roots, having to do with the spirituality. Dr. Mash and all of her staff had come to realize, by then, I went in 1997, she started the treatment rounds or the testing in 96. She'd had about 3 or 4 rounds. I am St. Kitts male number 17. And they had already realized that Ibogaine was like a reset button. Dunk. Reset to factory defaults. All the destruction and disarray of your various bodily and psychical systems was like returned to basic norm in a stroke. It's unbelievable. So you are very teachable once again and flexible, like I mentioned. Yes.
But do you know why it works? What's the mechanism of action? I mean, it must work on some brain chemistry.
Ibogaine is more complex than any other entheogen. That was Dr. Mash's stuff. She's a quantitative girl, you know, Department of Neurology, so she was all about the roots of metabolism and the receptor sites and blah, 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 like the biochemistry and like that. That is not my gig. I'm a qualitative researcher working on the heuristic and phenomenal aspects of the experience. However, there's plenty of information about that, and any competent, responsible, quantitative researcher in Ibogaine admits that we still don't have any idea where, of all the places it's working, but it works throughout the body on a host of different systems. It's not just in the brain or the central nervous system. It's working in the gut, it's working in the liver, it's working in various organs, it's working in your fatty tissues. It works throughout your whole gallbladder body. And it has to because, hey, after 22 years of shooting dope, my whole body was trashed. Right? I was so toxic. I don't even want to tell you what it was like. At some point in my treatment, I had to go to the bathroom. And what was squeezed out of me was like some kind of like asphalt or something. It was pretty gross, I'll tell you. And I was like cleansed out in 18 hours. And there was no withdrawal. It's a fucking miracle. So, yes, there's quite a bit of information. If you want to get all technical and like that, there's a lot of that information available. But everybody agrees that we still don't know everything that it's doing. I think that Vincent Ravalik, the French dude I mentioned, likened Ibogaine to being like taking a tryptamine psychedelic, like DMT or
like
something,
mushrooms.
plus ketamine and something else too, because there's a dissociative aspect. Like when I took it, my body just laid there like a sack of cement the whole time. I didn't care the least bit about what was happening with my body. It was totally in an interior kind of experience. Even though when I opened my eyes, like I'd see all of you, you just all have like a glowing aura of light around you as well as everything else. But I was uninterested in looking around me because I was doing my work inside. So,
You give a figure of 30% in your abstract. What was that figure?
yes, and I've seen as high as 45% since then. So Dr. Mash treated, I believe, a total of about 300 people. Quite a few people dosed more than once. I dosed twice. And incidentally, I was mildly spanked by a plant teacher for that the second time I took it, because the high dose used to detoxify an addict is like the initiatory dose of Ibogaine. So in the Bwiti cult, if you become a Bwitist, you know, it's a rite of passage, it's an ordeal drug, and they give you a walloping big dose. And if you survive, you're an adult member of the tribe. But you only take that dose once in your life. Now, Bwitists take Ibogaine repeatedly at special ceremonies throughout the rest of their life, but in a much lower dose. So I went a second time and did the high dose. And so plant teacher basically said, well, okay, your heart is good, your purpose was right, but no more, or you'll be disrespecting the medicine. Yeah.
What was the 30%? What was the 30%?
Oh, right. So of those people that Dr. Mash treated, As far as she tried to stay in touch with as many people as possible, but it's a voluntary gig. But the last time I spoke to her, over a third were still clean, like a couple of years after treatment. And the standard numbers, statistics, are that like between 90 and 95% of all addicts treated relapse within 6 months. So this is obviously several times more effective than any other technique.
So then your participation in this trial, did you have to meet certain, specifications before you entered the trial? And did you get a certain battery of tests before you entered and at subsequent intervals throughout your participation? So I guess what I'm saying is that how did she measure the success other than, the number of days to not taking drugs?
There's nobody uses anything else. I mean, in therapy, you can talk about other things, but when a government or any organization or agency wants to have a yardstick for measuring the efficacy of a treatment program, it has to be something basic, simple, quantitative, quantifiable. And it's basically like, have you relapsed and are you using again or not? You may be like in white knuckle recovery. You may be clean 10 years later, but a totally miserable bastard and unhappy and just you're somehow avoiding using. But they can't talk about that. That's, therapists can. But for broad statistical purposes, there has to be a simple yardstick, and it's always whether or not you're still clean in some given time period after treatment. And those time periods are, generally speaking, 6 months, 1 year, and 2 years. So as I recall from Dr. Mash, over 30% of the people she had treated were still clean 2 years later. So that's like way better than anything else going on.
But longitudinal studies are notoriously difficult
Yes.
to create with a group of recovering people.
Right.
A lot of people just disappear.
Yeah. So
Right.
have these results been published anywhere?
Well, Dr. Mash is no longer doing this. She ran those trials on St. Kitts, I think, for about 6 years. It was quite an affair for her. She just rented a small tourist compound, and she'd have to fly all her staff and all their equipment and the people to be treatment out to St. Kitts in the West Indies from Florida, set everything up, get all ready to go, do the thing, pack it all up, fly back, and she did that 3 or 4 times a year for 6 years. And she had plenty of other stuff going on at the same time, too. So she eventually stopped. She collected as much information as she needed to do, her piece of the puzzle. And she worked over it for several years, and in 2007 finally submitted a report about the conclusions from her trials. These would be the kind of quantitative, biochemical, physiological, neurological information that you're looking for. Yes.
I understand that from my reading that there have recently been some trials now that are dealing with MDMA and psilocybin mushrooms and things like that. And so what I'm wondering is, since those compounds also come under the category of entheogen, I'm wondering if either one of you can speak to any efforts that you might know about of political dimensions of activism on this, where people are treating ibogaine as one of a number of different alternative substances that can have the potential to remedy a lot more people in society. Because it just seems like to me that we're in a time now where trials are coming up for a lot of these these entheogenic substances and being taken seriously on a medical level. So it seems like it would just hopefully be a short leap to have it taken seriously on a political level.
Mm-hmm. You want to say something about
I think Larry knows a lot about this.
Are you familiar with MAPS?
Yes.
Okay, so MAPS is doing a lot of, I think they're doing on their second phase for MDMA and PTSD. And also with mushrooms, NYU, UCLA, and Johns Hopkins are doing a lot of work with that.
Right.
In fact, I think Johns Hopkins is looking at psilocybin for the treatment of nicotine addiction
Yeah, that's
at the
right.
moment. But politically, that's a whole nother ballgame. I mean, one of the ideas of ERIE is like, we don't know how long the window is going to be open, so let's get as much information out as we can because it gets shut in a second, and if that happens, so basically just
Yeah,
information
the focus is
gathering
more on
and
that
sharing and
information as
yeah.
opposed to really just trying to broaden it out.
for the time being. I mean,
Yeah.
But I honestly believe that politically, that it would help our situation a lot more if we ally ourselves with broader movements like the harm reduction movement, right? And also to push their agenda, to help push their agenda also. America traditionally is it's very black and white.
Sure.
It's all or nothing. And right now it's nothing. It's complete abstinence.
Yeah, well, and the reason why I asked is because I'm doing some political organizing at my college and trying to start a third party there, a student-led third party. And so it seems to me that with the amazing effectiveness that that we're getting from some of these substances, one of the things that occurs to me is, my God, we have to get that out, into the public, I walked past about 7 or 8 people who look like they could totally use this, just on the bus, just getting off the bus and coming here. And so I'm trying to address, listening to this, and I'm looking at it, at it from a political context. And so that's why, I'm glad, that's why I came, that's why I'm glad I'm here and having a chance to listen to you all say this, because I think that at some point, those of us who are activists are gonna have to, find some kind of a way to introduce, the efficacy of this into the broader social political discussion.
Right. And I think one of the best ways is through the treatment community. Is to educate the treatment community, but and what I was trying to say, and in doing so, we have to, there's a cost to this, and the cost to this is to break the traditional barriers that might be painful.
Yeah.
Right. Let the old ways slide, much like bloodletting. And bloodletting, everyone used like 200 years ago, right? But with scientific evidence, right? It was put to the wayside.
It's
Right.
hard to get a good medical leech these days.
Can you say something about the Canadian situation? I think one of the, I noticed recently that one of the centers in Vancouver is closing. Are they beginning to backslide? They're not getting financial support, or what is happening in the
I think
Canadian?
it was Gabor Mate's center was closed down. I mean, it's still an illegal substance in Canada.
Well, I think there are 2 legal centers, weren't there? One in Vancouver and one in Toronto? For
I'm not sure
ibogaine,
about
for
the one in
ibogaine
Toronto.
therapy?
I never heard of one in Toronto.
Yeah, no, there's an ibogaine one in Toronto, yes.
Yeah,
And
there's
there's an
2 of them.
ayahuasca one in
There's-
Vancouver.
Oh.
Yeah, you don't know about this.
No, I don't really.
Okay,
I
no, it's
mean,
actually an ibogaine center in Vancouver, and just recently there, I think, lack of funding or something, so I was wondering if the same phenomenon is
Well,
happening.
the political dimension is an important one that this gentleman brought up. And so for you, sir, for anybody who's interested in this particular story, one of these books, Iboga, The Visionary Root of African Shamanism, with Vincent Ravalac, Meliende, who was an Iboga shaman, and Agnes Peicheler, or another similar book, The Psychotropic Mind, The World According to Ayahuasca, Iboga, and Shamanism. I think it's in the first one, though. Ravalac goes through the entire history of Ibogaine in the West and all the political shenanigans and whatnot. So, like, back in between '94 and it all had to do with an election, dig. Between
Always does.
92 and 94, political action groups, ACT UP, for instance, and others were touting, were pushing for trials and legalization and so forth and so on. And it was making some progress against a lot of resistance, but there was progress being made. And just when it looked like they were going to authorize human clinical trials, there was an election, and a whole bunch of reactionary twits, Republicans and so forth, came in and immediately jumped all over it and shut everything down. And, you know, it's just with the usual, I don't know, man, it seems like a bad cartoon watching the politics of this country. But, you know, just like all the propaganda against entheogens from the 70s, when the government freaked out after ERIE and shut down everything. And then, you know, we heard for years about LSD causes your chromosomes to break and things like that. You know, I mean, you're going to have deformed babies and all kinds of total bullshit. And then you get movies like Reefer Madness, you know, Joe and Shirley, ultra straight, good college student, take one hit of reefer and she turns into a whore and he jumps out the window or something. So there was a lot of really jive, bad propaganda, and you know, the Republicans are still coming out with just things that are completely, so for instance, ibogaine, like most entheogens, I think all of them, is a Schedule I substance, like heroin and cocaine. So it means that there's a high potential for addiction and no medical use. And so that's why I was saying, you know, they're just lumping it together, saying it's as bad as heroin, when in fact it's exactly opposite. There's like no addictive potential for entheogens.
Actually, I was just going to answer this gentleman. Actually, I actually worked in recovery in Vancouver, so I have a little bit of knowledge about this. I'm not really sure what happened with Gabor Mate, but I can say this, is that in the recovery community itself, there's split between him. And it's not just the forces of the government, but the forces of the recovery community itself. Half the recovery community want to dismiss Gabor Mate. So he's not only facing pressure from the government, but also from the treatment community itself. If the treatment community negates what he's trying to push, then 3/4 of the pie is against him.
So
Right.
would you say that bears on the moralizing aspect of some
It bears on the fact that it bears on the fact that we don't have a cohesive, coherent philosophy on how to treat addiction. And we use a bit of this, we use a bit of that. This is okay, you know. And if I had a title, I would say spiritual pluralism is actually part of the problem, because we're moderates, which is fine. It's difficult for us to criticize others, right? And so we literally don't look at the claims that the other group actually makes and whether this is healthy in the treatment of addiction. And merely because it was devised 100 years ago and it worked then, this is the year 2012. Scientific evidence has come up that there's different treatments. But if we cling on to a bit of the old stuff doesn't like us. Right, so where do we go? Right, so I urge us to be brave and to try to derive a new philosophy, right? Rather than say, well, the old stuff is pretty good. Also, we can put a foot here, a foot there, and it ends up being weak. We end up cannibalizing ourselves. In this case, Gabor Mate. I actually read what he actually wrote about about Alcoholics Anonymous. I mean, he's not that complimentary about this. He moves away from that. As transpersonal psychologists, right? We take a little bit of this, a little bit of that.
And you might recall that I mentioned paradigm here at the beginning, if you can remember back that far. And we have to move from the old paradigm to the new paradigm. So, you know, here at CIIS, well, okay, not everybody's on the same page. Here in ERIE, we're revolutionaries. This is not the time for a centrist, middle-of-the-road, don't harm too many people position. This is time to stand up and make a stand, because the train is hurtling towards the bridge, but the bridge is out. This is not the time to open a debate and start a committee to figure out what we should do. Okay, we have to take action. We have to commit ourselves. We have to do what we feel morally called upon to do, whether or not we're going to get a fat job in corporate America, which we already know we're not going to.
So I don't know if I'm really following the two of you.
I'm just assuming. I'm just assuming that you guys are saying that there are alternative ways of treating addiction that are not accepted yet. So, what I don't hear from you, for example, let's talk about the ibogaine thing. I'm not hearing the adverse side of ibogaine. What ibogaine? Why is it not legal? If it produces all the good results that you are praising.
That's in the section I skipped, one of the sections.
So, because the reason I'm asking this, in the 60s, when the transpersonal movement started, there was there were many researches going on with entheogens and all those kind of things, with James, Huxley, Groff, and all those people. They had scientific research on those substances and had results that everybody can read. So, but it didn't go anywhere. And if there was a time that this movement could have made a difference, it would have been in the 60s, 70s, or 80s, because the whole West was swept by the entheogens and all those kind of things. Even when Huxley died, he told his wife, "Let me die in peace." He OD'd and he laughed. He was just smiling while he was dying, doing that. So, what I'm not hearing is what is the reason why that doesn't go through? Even Dr. Mash, who spent years and years and did all the research, and he just mentioned that he or she, I don't know, just abandoned and move on to something else, and you don't want to say anything about why. So there has to be a reason why. I understand political blah, 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 but we're here as researchers, right? We want something concrete to say, okay, this is what I think is positive, the goods that we get from the alternative treatment, and this is what I think it's not good. And maybe that is what the government is, whatever, making decision there says, no, this outweighs the good. But I don't see that from you. And I want to hear,
Time constraints. I mean, I had a section on that, and I didn't really go into that because that wasn't part of this paper. However, I mentioned it briefly. Well, in terms of, this is related to paradigm, I will refer you to Hofstadter's famous work on anti-intellectualism in America. There's also another book, I can't remember, a more recent book along the same line by a lady author called Unscientific America. Remember, during the Bush administrations, there was a lot of discussion about the misuse, abuse, and ignoring of science whenever it didn't serve their purposes. I direct your attention to the character of healthcare in this nation, which is based upon profit, not your health. So, Big Pharma has no interest in manufacturing ibogaine and making it available, because if you can take something once and annihilate your addiction, they're not going to make money on it. They want to make things that you have to take all the time, so they can make a lot of money about that. And so they're totally against it. And when you hear the arguments, so I mentioned that book, right? There's a whole section towards the back where he discusses the history of Western research, blah, blah, and a lot of it is political stuff that he talks about there too. And it's very interesting because he's a Frenchman, so he's an outsider, so we don't have to say he's like caught up in the partisan politics of the US. He's looking from the outside and just saying, they're full of shit.
But Adrian, I think that what we have to acknowledge is that there's a potentiality for abuse. It has to be part of the entheogenic experience is in a controlled environment, and outside of the controlled environment, these substances could have the potential for people to abuse them, and I think this has to be acknowledged.
But not in an addictive fashion. You can abuse anything. You can eat ice cream until you pop, and then maybe you'll get diabetes or something too, right? You can ride your bicycle in heavy traffic.
No,
I mean,
but LSD was used could be used in an abusive fashion, and people, that's where bad trips came from. In the
Nobody
1960s,
is suggesting that we're going to manufacture and prescribe ibogaine so you can take a prescription home and use it however and whenever and wherever you want.
Right, and I
We're
think
only
this is-
suggesting that it would be used in closed treatment centers by professionals in controlled circumstances.
But you said yourself that nobody knows how ibogaine works. If you cannot control a product or a drug or whatever it is or a treatment, how do you want to prescribe it to people? Because nobody knows anything about it. It's just that it saved you, it saved
That's a
some
bit
people.
extreme, Ebede.
Pardon?
That's a little extreme. We
Oh.
know quite a bit about ibogaine, just because we don't know everything. We also, I mean, that's the scientific tests for what happens when ibogaine enters your body, blah, blah. But we have a large and ever accumulating body of anecdotal reports by addicts who have taken it and been treated, and they're all saying the same thing. Holy shit, I took one dose, and instead of, in fact, in the section of the book I mentioned, at one point, an important American official, I can't remember his name and his exact position, but he was involved with this, went abroad. We were going to have a big meeting here in the U.S., and then the reactionary politicals shut that down. So this guy took a vacation and on his own dime went to Amsterdam, where addicts were being treated with ibogaine, and he observed quite a number of trials. And he says in a report, and eventually, make a long story short, when he came back, his report about his experience there was legitimized when the political climate changed again, and there was like a better period, and so he was allowed to actually talk about his experience there. And he said, there was this addict, and he says, addicts, you know, after treatment, all they ever talk about is getting more, after most treatment, all they ever talk about is getting more dope and how they can hustle and so forth. After ibogaine, so this guy had been a heroin addict for years and years, the next day he was just looking for an Egg McMuffin. He didn't care about anything. And so, actually,
another
the
fine topic,
original
but-
anecdotal discovery by Howard Lotsoff took place accidentally when he, as a using heroin addict in New York City, scored some ibogaine on the black market on the street. Somebody said, hey, this is a great trip, man, you'll have a lot of fun. So he bought it, you know, for amusement, took the ibogaine, had a trip. The next morning, eventually, he got up and went out and was sitting at a sidewalk cafe, reading the morning paper, having a coffee and a bun, and suddenly it dawned on him, holy shit, I've been up for 3 hours and I haven't thought about dope once. And yesterday, I had a habit. When you have a habit, the first thing you think about when consciousness comes back to you is, do I have any dope? Where is it? How am I going to get it?
So I'm just going to stretch everybody's question a little bit, and can you speak to the possible risks of taking ibogaine if you don't have the container? That's the first part of my question. And the second part of my question is, can you just give a few examples of how ibogaine is different from the methadone treatment?
Well, in the first place, any sane and responsible psychedelic researcher, Groff, for instance, will emphasize that this is not something you play around with. You can get hurt. Set and setting is everything, and most people are not conscious enough to be fully aware of their own mindset and don't pay enough attention to the setting in which they take it. Again, Ravelek, Parcher, in this book that I mentioned, say the same thing. This is not something to play around with. It's a powerful psychoactive substance, and by the very nature of entheogens, what's going to happen is completely unpredictable. And so you definitely should take it in a community, in a safe container. So at the very least, if you're taking it socially, like when I was a hippie, I took acid once or twice a week, every week for 5 or 6 years. But almost never alone. I always took it with 3 or 4 of my comrades. Usually we went out into the woods because we were woods hippies, and or we went to a house and partied. We were in company, and if somebody started flipping out, there would be other people there who were entheogenically expert or experienced at least, to assist them, and of course, pick up the phone and call an ambulance if it came to that.
So are you advocating that Ibogaine should be marketed as a controlled
I am
substance?
not advocating that Ibogaine should be marketed. I am advocating that Ibogaine should be legalized for use in inpatient locked facilities where you go in and take it under the direction and supervision and monitoring by professionals. When Dr. Mash did this, very professional, there was, for one thing, a nurse in the room with you on duty the whole time, as long as it took. I mean, they rotate the nurses. There was always a nurse present right in the room. They didn't disturb us. They didn't talk. They were just sitting there silently watching us, but they were there if we needed it. There was also a physician and a psychiatrist nearby on call in case it came to that. Of course, Dr. Mash had several therapists and social workers with her at the same time, and graduate students, all of whom stood by to assist. And of course, as they did round after round, they became more experienced in the effects of Ibogaine and what could be done with it. And they noticed after a while that the people who were being dosed were extremely teachable for the first time in years immediately thereafter. There's a great possibility of beginning therapy when people are in this new malleable kind of state. So this is not a toy, but Dr. Mash was very professional. So I was talking to her on the phone when I was still up in Massachusetts. She was down in Florida. And she said, now, I have to tell you, there could be a little danger. There is a track record. More people seem to have died taking Ibogaine than other entheogens, like ayahuasca or something. However, there's a certain number of people who have died after being treated with Ibogaine. However, investigation and research has shown that the majority of those people died from other causes, not from the Ibogaine. Specifically, I told you about the reset button. So I was a junkie for a long time. I had a walloping big tolerance, but after I took Ibogaine, I had no tolerance. So if I were foolish enough to think, now that I'm clean, I can get really high again because I haven't been able to throw a good knot in years, and went out and fired up half of what I'd done before, it could have killed me flat right on the spot. There was a lady who was found to have actually taken heroin while she was on Ibogaine in a treatment center. And other people took their drug of choice or something within a couple of days thereafter. That killed them also. Ibogaine does seem to produce, tends to produce tachycardia or speeded up and fluttering heart pattern. So if you have a heart condition, you should not be doing Ibogaine. So Dr. Mash said, well, I had to do two things. I had to get a complete physical, so she had all that information, especially about the heart, and I had to be off of all other medication. So I was on SSRIs at the time. I can't remember which one, not Prozac, but a congener of it. I had to get off that. So there was no drug interaction going on. But of course, I couldn't get off dope. I used the day before I took the Ibogaine. Ibogaine will take you as toxic as you come. It's like the Statue of Liberty for addicts. Bring me your bedraggled, downtrodden, tired, toxic, sick, and defeated addicts, and I'll take you any way you come and still fix you up.
But there's a contradiction there.
Pardon?
There seems to be a contradiction there.
What is that?
If Dr. Marsh said that there's a track record of people dying from Ibogaine, and you said later that because it wasn't Ibogaine per se, but some other stuff that he took, that you have to do a physical, because there's tachycardia thing, and then there should not be an interaction.
In the first place, this was in 1997 that she said that to me, and much of the investigation that has revealed these alternative causes of death in so-called Ibogaine deaths took place since then. But even if it had taken place, there was some possible danger, and she had to alert me about that. My position was I practically laughed in her face. It's like, excuse me, I'm dying right now. I know absolutely I'm going to die very shortly. It can't be any worse. I'll take this jazz and maybe I'll have a chance, which I don't have now. And a less extreme expression of that was the conclusion arrived at by the New Zealand authorities, who finally decided that, weighing all things considered, any possible dangers and difficulties associated with ibogaine were insignificant in the face of the social ills that they cured.
So she must have tried to submit this to the United States FDA for approval, and it obviously was rejected. Do you know why? I mean, I just find it weird that she would, first of all, go, to some island to do her research.
Well, but I told you.
and-
You have to go to an island because it's not
Yeah,
legal
they
here. You
can't
can't
do
do
it
it here.
It was submitted to
No,
the FDA in
but if
2007.
she had gotten approval to do her
She
study
did.
from the FDA,
The
then
FDA
she
finally
would-
gave the approval, the green light for human clinical
Right.
trials to take place at the University of Miami.
But then you said that she couldn't get funding, so do you know why she couldn't get funding? But I get back to my original question, did she submit it to the results of her studies to the FDA for approval?
In 2007 she did.
And,
That was- that
was it
was-
rejected?
Well, it was just in 2007. So all her grant finding was before that, or all of her searching for
So
grants
this is
before that?
2012.
Right, she's not doing it.
So it doesn't take that long to get it approved.
But it was approved and published, yeah.
No. I mean, when I'm talking about submitting the results of her clinical trial to the FDA for approval, if they'd approved it, it would have been legal in the United
Legal.
States. So it
To
hasn't been
approve the use
approved.
of ibogaine, is that what you're saying?
Yes,
It would be approved and not a scheduled drug anymore?
right. If they
Yeah.
would have
Well,
approved it. for
medical
some-
marijuana, I mean, the NDA is showing that medical marijuana.
NDA is not, it
But
has
that-
nothing to do with it.
Why would it change the
Never mind.
law? Why would it change the scheduling of the drug?
If she's doing a clinical trial to try to get it approved for use.
Well, maybe that's not what she was trying to do, right?
Well,
It was-
okay.
it was just
No,
for
no,
her
she
to
was.
Well, he said it was a.
use. Yeah, for
clinical
her to
trial.
use though, not to make it legal for everyone, right?
No,
No, legal for
she
everyone.
was trying to
was
get the
trying to
drug
legalize
into the American pharmacopoeia so
Oh,
it could
yeah.
be used, as I was saying, in clinics for treatment.
And the way you do that is to get it approved by the FDA.
Oh, okay.
Right. Have you been listening?
Yeah, that's.
The
Yeah, but you're not
AMA,
said
Big Pharma, and Big
Yeah,
Insurance
yeah,
are all
that's-
locked
it's
together into
yeah,
one thing that
it's
says,
political.
no, we don't want Ibogaine.
It's a political.
And
I-
That's very conjectural, though. That's very conjectural.
It is conjectural,
That's
and
very
it doesn't really
conjectural.
work.
Well, if you
Yeah.
read the story that in this book that I mentioned, just the history of the over the course of a decade of what's gone on with Ibogaine, and Ibogaine isn't alone, but it focuses on that. You'll see that there's just so much political nonsense and people in charge who are very moralizing and think that this is a bad thing and it shouldn't be allowed. It's as simple as that. It's completely non-rational, but there it is. It's gone up and down and up and down, and there have been some cool people who thought, yes, we should do this, but they're always caught up and destroyed by, well, look what's going on now.
Yeah, and on the
Medical
issue-
marijuana.
on the
It's
issue of
supposed to be okay
conjecture,
here.
yeah,
The DEA is
yeah.
still busting into shops, arresting people, and things like
Yeah,
that.
and on the issue of conjecture, there's a documentary on Democracy Now! I can't remember the name of it. It's 3 hours, and it's filled with documented cases of how the pharmaceutical industry is primarily running the show to a certain degree in American politics. I can't remember the name of it. Drug Nation or something like that. It's 3 hours. It's well documented, and it talks about how fully entrenched the pharmaceutical.
We still have a war on drugs.
Yeah.
Whatever the government actually says. I mean, I remember Bill Moyers or somebody coming on the Sunday show 10, 20 years ago saying, well, obviously the war on drugs is a failed concept. We still got it today. Does it make any sense? No. Well, yes, it makes sense. If you think in terms of 1984, if you want to, if as a government you want to have control of people's lives, well then that's an easy way of doing it.
Sorry, I just want to cut off. We have about 2 minutes left, so we'll take a last question or comment.
Adrian, what's the name of the book you're referring to?
It is Iboga, The Visionary Root of African Shamanism by Vincent Ravalek, Malyendi, and Agnes Peicheler, published by Park Street Press in Rochester, Vermont, in 2007.
So I don't know if you want to conclude with some final comments. Otherwise, I know this is obviously a very controversial and charged topic, given this dialogue and what we do as ERIE members. And I'm not sure if Adrian will be around or if you're able to offer some more feedback to those that want additional information. That's a possibility.
Yeah, okay, it's getting, sure. I mean, you know, when we're finished here, if you want to chat with me, I'll do that for a while. The building is going to be closing in about 45 minutes. So
Or you can write your blog. You can write your blog on the board over there. People
Oh,
can check
yes.
that out.
Right, so last summer, my story just burst out of me. I had to write it for my own therapeutic purposes, but in about 2 months, I wrote about 120 pages, single-spaced, of my story, and now it's on a...
Is it HTTP or www?
Yeah, it's all.
yeah, I think no, just HTTP. I think you'll get there either way.
Yeah, either way.
The important thing is it's on a blog site called Tumblr, Tumblr, and so you put in my name, Adrian Aller, as one word, .tumblr.com, and you'll go to Climbing the Holy Mountain, which is my story, and book 3 has the Ibogaine experience in it. So thank you for coming here this evening. I hope it's been interesting, possibly stimulating and informative. It's certainly been informative for me, because I have to figure out how I can take less time. But in any case, it gave me a chance to work on my dissertation proposal. So right now I'm in touch with the person who's in charge of the MAPS Ibogaine trials in New Zealand. And one day, those Ibogaine trials will be here in the United States. And yours truly will be right there. Thanks for coming.
I just really wanted to thank Larry, Jordan, and Adrian for being a part of ERIE and for carrying on the good fight.
Thanks, Peter, for coming.